here today and to talk at the conference. So thank you for inviting me.
Okay, what I've done is just put on recording. So now all this will go down in history from henceforth. So have the two of you decided who goes first?
I think Chip was going to do a quick introduction.
Okay.
And we'll just go from there.
Okay.
Great. You ready to get started, Michael?
Yes. Let's
okay.
Go.
Great. Thank you. I'd just like to give folks a little background on this project before turning it back over to Brad and Steve. At our last meeting, we discussed this potential project to connect Powderhorn and Wolf Lake. And both Michael and a few others at the meeting had mentioned that the idea of connecting Powderhorn and Wolf Lake had been around for a number of years and really just hadn't gotten quite off the ground. But I'm newer to this, and our more recent interest in this idea grew out of a project that was funded by IDNR Coastal to look at water issues at Powderhorn Lake. We were interested there in kind of two things, the water quality and the water quantity. So how high were the water levels and what was going on with inputs to the lake. And interestingly, that study had two really good outcomes. The first was that there are not any major water quality issues at Powderhorn. They could not locate any inputs of pollutants or contaminants from the outside, which we were concerned with originally. So that was the good news on that. The other item was that they identified an option for lowering our long elevated lake levels at Powderhorn via an alternative connection to Wolf Lake. Through that process, draft engineering design was put together for the connection. However, there's no funding to really make that project happen. It's a fairly expensive process. And so at that point, I guess Audubon Great Lakes entered the picture. We'd been talking with them and other partners for quite some time about this issue. And Audubon Great Lakes made some really great efforts to seek out and establish some partnerships to make this project design a reality. And without giving any more detail at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Brad Kasberg from Audubon Great Lakes to tell you more about what's going on with the development of that project.
Thank you, Chip, and thank you everyone for inviting us to speak on this project. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll share the PowerPoint that I have. Can you all just confirm that you can see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Looks good.
Okay, great. All right. So this project, again, Chip mentioned that Audubon sort of came into the picture here following a hydrologic study that Forest Preserves had done with Hay and Associates, the engineering firm that conducted it. They recommended a series of plans that we'll walk through to connect Powderhorn ultimately to Wolf Lake. And through some conversations with the Great Lakes Commission and NOAA, we were able to secure funding for a project described mostly as fish passage. That's the funding mechanism that generates the Great Lakes Commission NOAA partnership funding. So this project, which is focused on hydrological connection and the raising and lowering of water levels, had that extra layer of habitat benefit sort of proposed by the Great Lakes Commission, which meant that the engineering documentation that Hay and Associates generated, which was basically about a 90% completion, meant that the remaining 10% had to address, to the best of our abilities, improved fish passage through the series of pipes and swales that would ultimately connect Powderhorn and Wolf Lake. I also wanted to touch on some other elements of the project that they were interested in. First of all, again, we're at record high water levels across the Great Lakes, and particularly Lake Michigan. This was taken earlier this year. High water levels are seeping over, they generally seep through the riprap, but can ultimately even get to the height of the rail itself. And spill out into the street. So there is, while it's not a serious flooding concern, where it's not flooding yards and homes frequently, there's still a standing water issue. So again, the funders were interested in having a project that could improve habitat while also improving some of the neighborhood flooding issues as well, some mitigation. And I will add that the railroad is obviously keen on not having this happen. There's one thing for water to seep through riprap, another for some of that wood and the connections of the rail to be intermittently submerged in water. So I just want to give kind of a high-level engineering view of what's going on, and then I'll hand it back over to Steve to run through some of the more nitty-gritty fish passage elements and the fish populations here. So these are the three bodies of water that we are concerned about, that we are doing some restoration on, and obviously they are connected. But the other thing about these sites is that adjacent habitat is also of high concern. So dune swale habitat is of very high quality in the Powderhorn Lake in the nature preserve area, but it's suffering from high water levels too. It's just not draining as frequently as the land managers would like, and so this will ultimately allow water to drain, yes, out of Powderhorn Lake, but bringing that water out of the swales as well to revive some of that sandier, drier plant-loving species. What's really exciting is this 55-acre lake or shallow marsh. Right now is mostly open water, but that is ripe with opportunity. If we can drop water levels, that'll really spur a lot of exciting vegetation throughout. It's pretty consistent in its depth. There's a few points where it gets fairly deep, but the hemi-marsh potential is really significant there. But of course, we have a series of railroads and access lanes and real streets blocking it. So we need to do as much as we can to work with the city and the rail lines to facilitate not just the construction of these pipes, but the construction of pipes that are of appropriate size for fish passage. And ultimately, there is some vacant land that was purchased by the forest preserves a few years back. That is the last step in the connection to Wolf Lake, and that would be like a larger open swale system. So our goals here, again, are pretty straightforward, and you're all familiar with. It's to reestablish hydrological connectivity with Wolf Lake, reestablish that emergent marsh habitat in the shallow open water areas, but then also not just reconnection, but creating a water control structure to allow control of that flooding so that the forest preserves can really maximize habitat benefits as throughout the year and over the course of several years. So I will hand it over to Steve here, just so that he can kind of run through some of the broader history of the site and kind of tackle the fish element of this. And I'll be controlling the slides, so just let me know when you want me to move forward.
Sounds good. All right, thanks a lot, Chip and Brad. So I'll get going here. I just kind of like to start out with this slide. I thought it was I like the old historical pictures. This is a nice one that Audubon Great Lakes provided for us, just to show what the area was like from more of a historical perspective back in '29, how beautiful and simple things were. When the area in the southeast side of Chicago was more of marshes and open water and a little less developed. So this is, just kind of to highlight the area. You notice the two red triangles. The red triangle at the top is the Eggers Marsh property that was restored just last year. That was kind of the kickoff of this project. And then the triangle to the south would be the Powderhorn Marsh that Brad was just talking about. So this is just kind of a nice glimpse of what it looked like in the past before we developed so much on it. Next slide. We get to the next slide, Brad? All right. As Chip and Brad both mentioned, this was more of a hydrological project to begin with. So as stated and viewed in that last map, the area was more of a collection of marshes, rivers, and lakes, including Wolf Lake and where Powderhorn now is, that was unfortunately kind of completely isolated through urban and industrial development. It's really segregated these tracts of natural area, which has definitely caused some problems for them. What we've been experiencing over the past couple decades is just really sustained high water levels that has caused a lot of problems, like Brad mentioned, with flooding in the neighborhood, but also with a disconnect of the natural fish, bird, waterfowl, plant, micro or macroinvertebrate, pretty much all the biological forms that use this very rich natural area historically. As Brad stated, Powderhorn was historically connected, but however that to Wolf Lake, but that connection has kind of become very compromised. So that was what kind of spurred this problem. And I'll talk a lot about these a little more in depth moving forward. So that was what kind of spurred the idea to re-establish this connection back in 17. Next slide, please. So this map's pretty similar to what Brad was showing, kind of a backed up view of the area in question. The Eggers Marsh to the north, a new water control structure has been installed as of this past spring that the Forest Preserve has full control. So that's a really exciting development or step forward in this whole process that is allowing the Forest Preserve District a lot more hydrological control of some of the areas to the north of the complex we're dealing with. Towards the east there, I definitely don't want to get into this too much. I'll leave that to Tom and Frank, our lake experts on Wolf Lake. But obviously the main crux of this is the central larger body, the roughly 1,000-acre Wolf Lake. I can't speak too much on the Indiana side, but I know the Illinois side is just under 400 acres and about 15-foot depth with its normal water elevations at about 581 feet. Normal water levels are at about 581-foot elevation. This is significant because Powderhorn, which I'll touch on in a few minutes, is about 585, just over 585. So that 4-foot drop in elevation from the Powderhorn system into the Wolf Lake system is going to greatly help control any flooding while also establishing this biological connection that we're going to be creating. And then it connects into Lake Michigan through the drainage ditches. So this kind of reestablishes a nice connection of a larger wetland watershed that has just been segregated over the past 50 to 100 years. Wolf Lake is heavily stocked, both Indiana and Illinois sides, as recreational fishing lakes. They are managed very actively by the respective state biologists. So they're a highly popular and recreational area for fishing. Moving over to the forest, more of the areas of the Forest Preserve focus would be the Powderhorn system. So what we're dealing with specifically, as Brad just mentioned, is Powderhorn Lake, furthest to the south, which is about a 48-acre man-made lake. The Powderhorn Marsh, which is connected to it, is immediately to the north. That's about a 55-acre shallow marsh area. The fairly newly purchased 134th Street Marsh or Square Marsh will soon be connected to that. And then that smaller parcel of land is just to the north of that, the Wolf Lake Connector, as we'll call it. So we'll look closer to those in a second here. Next slide, please. So this is kind of zooming in on the Powderhorn system. As I said, it's a 48-acre lake built in 58. It was stocked heavily initially after establishment to create a public fishery. Early stockings included a ton of northern pike. It was really established as a very good northern pike lake, but it also included a lot of largemouth bass, green sunfish, bluegill, green sunfish, even some bullhead. This system is very productive for such other species as grass pickerel and yellow perch. They've done very well, crappie have established them very well, to the point where the Forest Preserve District doesn't even stock these fish, these lakes very often. We do throw channel catfish in them to kind of supplement existing populations, but for the most part, the system does have a very good bass, northern pike, perch, a whole multitude of species that I'll get into in a minute. Very well established population. So it is a very nice, popular fishing area that, as stated, you're looking at about 100 acres for the whole system as compared to about 1,000 acres of the Wolf Lake system. So by reestablishing these, it's really definitely going to help the watershed, the overall water body system by connecting them to allow for not only water level control, which is very important, but also the genetic diversity and fish population connections. Right now, as of current depth readings, on average, the marsh is holding water at about 4 feet deep is what we've found, when historically, dating back 15, 20, 25 years, it was more about half a foot to a foot and a half. So water levels are definitely in the order of about 2 feet high. So that's impacted the usability of that marsh area, the Powderhorn Marsh area, for the general fisheries of the lake. Next slide, please. So kind of taking a quick step back, this issue all kind of arose, as Brad and Chip were saying. If you look at that red line to the right, the historical natural drainage of the marsh and lake system was underneath those train tracks that Brad had the nice picture of. The water basically seeped through the riprap of the train tracks and then went through a series of culverts and pipes that were not under Forest Preserve control, ultimately draining into kind of the southeast corner of Wolf Lake. Over the years, due to lack of maintenance and clogging up, that drainage ability has greatly been reduced. So what's happened over the past decade or two is that the whole Powderhorn system has just been really backed up. So the red line to the left is kind of what Brad was showing you earlier. That was the proposed new flow path to connect the systems, and that's what we'll be dealing with here on the next slide. So next slide, please. So this is kind of more of an architectural drawing of the proposed new system. What you're looking at the bottom of the screen would be the north shore of that Powderhorn Marsh, which is currently blocked by the train tracks that Brad was showing you. The red lines indicate possibly where pipe would go. The blue lines indicate the open water. So the connection is looking at a series of 3 sets of pipes and then a couple of open water areas. These plans I'd like to point out are about 5-6 months old. So things have changed. There has been a lot of work done to this. This is just to give you the general idea. The most exciting thing about this in my mind is at the bottom of the text box, the water control structure. By putting a water control structure on Forest Preserve District property, the Forest Preserve is now going to have the ability and access to completely manipulate the water levels to control for fish spawn, for migratory waterfowl, for the dune and swale system. The water control structure is going to be designed to allow for fish passage, albeit smaller fish. We're not going to be getting, lunker 36-inch northern swimming through there most likely, but it will allow for fish passage, which is really going to greatly enhance the transport of genetic material and fish species from the waterways. So we're very excited about that. At the top, the last parcel of land that we haven't talked a whole lot about, more recently purchased, we're calling it the Wolf Lake Connector, is a previously developed, I guess, brown space, you could call it, that is now more of a green space. The Forest Preserve is looking to do some restoration work, and that's where an open air ditch will be. That'll act to, one, beautify the area, but also greatly, it'll finish the connection between the square marsh, the 134th Street marsh, with Wolf Lake ultimately. And that'll be a nice open air ditch. We wanted to keep as much of this system open air as possible because that's obviously the best scenario for the biotic life that'll be hopefully transporting back and forth between these water bodies. Next slide. So what we're looking at here is more of a close-up of where the water control structure is going to be. It'll be nice to have it on the Forest Preserve District side of the property, away from the access or the open water of the marsh. It's going to be a series of connections between the water control structure and then a ramp that's going to allow basically the fish to easily transport through the system into the open water. There will be swales, sediment capture areas allowed to filter out this, but ultimately it's going to be as open as possible for fish passage into the larger square marsh, which I didn't mention in the last slide. It's a 28-acre parcel of natural property that the Forest Preserve, or restored natural property that the Forest Preserve has purchased, with a large marsh area, depending on water levels, upwards of 6 to 7 acres of open water area during the wet seasons and the opening and draining of the slough. So it'll provide a nice additional wetland area for the biotic life to reside in and utilize during the connection. Next slide, please. So the main goals of this, as we've kind of talked about a lot, I'm going to concentrate more on the left. By connecting these water bodies, we're ultimately connecting the fisheries of the larger Wolf Lake system with the smaller Powderhorn system. This is going to definitely allow for increased species diversity in the smaller, less populated Powderhorn system, but also the increase of genetic materials between these. Both lakes have very good populations of various fish species that I'll talk about, I think, in the next slide. And obviously, whenever you open up the gene pool, you allow for better reproductive success. We're also basically providing a lot of new breeding habitat in these smaller non-fishing areas that would be the marshes in between the two connections. This ultimately is going to, go back there real quick, sorry. It'll help to reestablish more of the true hemi-marsh system that the Powderhorn Marsh is. Right now, being upwards of over 4 feet deep and constantly holding standing water, it almost has created more of an open lake system, which has allowed for a lot more predation and less successful reproductive success for the Powderhorn system. It also has allowed for kind of the infiltration of some of the aquatic invasive plant species that may be existing in a lot of the Forest Preserve District lakes. Some of your more rooted aquatic vegetation types like Eurasian milfoil and curleaf pondweed are able to establish a lot better in the deeper system that Powderhorn Marsh currently is holding. So by reducing that water, it'll greatly help us to control the natural vegetation that's growing in the marsh system. This ultimately is going to provide better habitat for young fish, invertebrates, waterfowl, things of that nature. The right side is more the ancillary goals of it, which is going to be, as I just stated, improving the native aquatic plants, definitely the Powderhorn, the marsh for marsh birds, and ultimately the water levels in the nature preserve swale system. I think Brad's going to touch on those a little bit in a second, so I don't want to get too much into those. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So the big crux of the project, I think, is the species and genetic diversity that this reconnection can help establish. Looking at historical records, Wolf Lake has pretty much, right around 40 species of game and non-game fish that have been collected by state biologists through records. This spans everything from some of your Lake Michigan species, alewife, carp suckers, perch, walleye, smallmouth bass, you name it, to a lot of your more inland pond fish that Powderhorn may have. Your basic bass, crappie, bluegill, sunfish, bullhead type species. Powderhorn, current records only have us listed about 30 to 33 species. So it's definitely a little more species void than a larger Wolf Lake system is. So this will definitely help to increase that. Looking at records, the third bullet point down there, there's potential introduction of at least 5 good quality game and non-game species, including walleye, red ear sunfish, rock bass, white crappie, and quillback carp suckers. Anytime you can increase the genetic diversity in the system is always going to be good. These are all species that would definitely help to contribute to the overall health of a system like Powderhorn. What's also very exciting is some of the overlap of species of really good quality species fish where you could increase the genetic diversity. Powderhorn has a phenomenal yellow perch population, as does Wolf Lake and the Lake Michigan system, obviously. So increasing the yellow perch is going to be phenomenal. Powderhorn has the only naturally reproducing northern pike population in Cook County, following the initial stockings post establishment and build of Powderhorn Lake back in the late 50s. It was stocked for about 6 or 8 years with pike. It has not been stocked since. The northern pike population is phenomenal there, and it's all natural. And a lot of that has to do with the prolific nursery and spawning habitat that the marsh provided. Grass pickerel are another species that do very well in there. And then some of your non-game species that are of good high quality that have been decreasing in numbers in Powderhorn Lake, but have this potential to increase with the connection to Wolf Lake, like the Lake Chubsucker and Brook Silverside. Really cool side of this would be some of your state threatened species like Iowa darter and banded killifish, which we do have good populations of at least the banded killifish still in Powderhorn. Iowa darter not as much, but anytime you can improve the habitat of E&T species is always good. I don't want to get too much in the banded killifish. We currently are working on research with Dr. Willink on that, so he may have more to say about that later, but that is something we're definitely excited about and looking into. Next slide. So one of the last really exciting portions about this project is the Forest Reserve was recently able to partner up, well, not partner up, we're already working with, but able to bring in the Illinois Natural History Survey's Prairie Research Institute. We specifically have a couple of fish biologists from the Kaskaskia Biological Station, Dr. Joe Parkos and Dr. Anthony Parecka. So we brought them in about 1.5 years ago, and early on they were really helping us a lot, and still are, with some of the early research and design aspects of the projects, you know, specifically tube lengths and flow rates and things like that. So they've been integral in kind of consulting with and helping us steer a lot of those aspects of the project. They also, what's been great is are kind of taking the lead on the fish sampling and water quality analysis of the entire system, basically the Wolf Lake side, the Powderhorn Lake and the Powderhorn Marsh water bodies of the system. They're doing kind of an extensive pre and post-construction analysis. They actually just wrapped up the pre-construction analysis this season. We don't have any data yet. Hopefully we have some of that by the November 19th public meeting. But that's going to consist of the results from basically the next 5 objectives, actually the next 4 objectives, so I can kind of run through those. There's not going to be much work going on next year, on 2021, for the Natural History Survey. However, they'll pick up again in 2022 post-construction, where they can complete the field work and then analyze a lot of the data. So the objectives of the project are as follows. The first one is assessing water quality. The water quality assessments are going to look at your basic water chemistry and water analysis of the lakes, looking at things like chloride content, alkalinity, phosphate levels. We're also looking a lot at chlorophyll A levels to determine like planktonic abundance, as well as your typical measurements of temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, things like that, water clarity. So they're going to be doing some extensive water quality analysis on all the sites, basically before and after the project. Objective number 2 is going to be looking at the zooplankton communities. This is obviously important as a good indicator of overall water quality, but also the food base for your reproductive, your young fish and your larval fish. So that's very important. Plus the very impressive invertebrate and zooplankton communities that exist in both Powderhorn and especially Wolf Lake, with some very unique invertebrates there. The main objective, number 3, is going to be assessing the fish communities. They're basically going to be looking at game and non-game fish populations in all 3 water bodies, using a series of flake netting, DC netting, direct current electrofishing, flake netting, seining net, to look at pretty much all fish communities. They're doing a lot of the fish sampling in the early spring and the late fall months, where a lot of the water quality and zooplankton tests are going to be getting done throughout the entire spring and fall months. Their basic window is monthly sampling efforts from May through September to October. Quantifying the 4th objective, quantifying reproductive activity in fish communities. That's going to be doing larval sampling of fish to see the reproductive success of fish in the systems and see if there's any improvements. So that's some exciting data that we haven't had in the past that'll be really nice to complement the project. And then the 5th one's going to be very exciting. This is assessing the functional connectivity of the systems. which is essentially the movement between the lakes. This hasn't started yet, obviously, because there's no connection in the lakes. But what they're looking at doing is installing pit tags or passive integrative transponders into the fish that they collected, doing the fish community assessment projects. In follow-up years, they'll be able to test based on recapture of fish that they may have already put transmitters in. But a second layer of this, which is going to be really exciting, is by putting radio frequency antennas at certain pinch points, which would probably be the pipes of the culvers. They can assess movement between the water bodies back and forth. Obviously, it's going to pick up the signal, the pit tag, as they pass by the antennas. So that's going to be a really cool aspect of the project that we should get some really fun data on. Probably not for at least 2 to 3 years, because the connection hasn't been established. It may take the fish a little while to find it, but we're really excited about seeing ultimately what this connection, what great opportunities it's provided these all these great fish species between this, hopefully newly established connection of the larger lake system. So we're really excited about a lot of this work, and can't wait to get it going. So that's all I have on the fish for now.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Brad, were you going to add something? Could you?
Yeah, I was gonna jump on to talking about the marsh bird monitoring side of things. How are we on time?
5 minutes at the most.
Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect. All right, so I'll tackle the marsh bird monitoring side of things. Obviously, for marsh birds, what's good for fish is good for marsh birds, because most of them ultimately eat fish. So it's a kind of a good merging of monitoring methods here to assess what's going on. I just have this slide to showcase how we're really framing restoration at 134th Street Marsh and Powderhorn Marsh. We really want to get Hemi Marsh development in there. That dynamic change in water levels that we can get once we reconnect them and get the water control structure in will have really exciting results for vegetation regeneration and the killing off of non-native species, and all of that obviously cascades to fish and to marsh birds. And this is obviously been a part of Walter's vision for marsh birds, and he's had an eye on powderhorn as he's had an eye on a lot of the wetlands in the Calumet region. His effort here in monitoring powderhorn has been essential over the past few years. These are the points that historically Walter has monitored. I think this year was the first time that someone else did it, but these yellow points are where you go in the early hours of the morning to monitor these marsh birds. But we're not just looking at that at these points. We're also looking at the wetland vegetation and composition to track how plants are responding to this restoration, and then also water level change. So we've installed gauges to track water levels. There's 4 of them throughout the site. So we can kind of keep tabs on sort of the systematic fluctuation of water levels as we move on through this project. So this is the result of some of our work at all of the sites within the Calumet region, the Illinois side of the Calumet region. Powderhorn is 4th from the left. So you can see that there's been a steady increase in marsh bird occupancy, but compared to some other sites, it's not as high as, for example, Big Marsh or Burnham Prairie or Eggers Grove, which is interesting because overall, powderhorn in the nature preserve area are pretty high quality. So it does go to show that the water levels are really hindering that marsh development for fish and marsh birds within Powderhorn Marsh. And I wanted to just highlight an example of a similar site where success has been documented through marsh bird monitoring. So Big Marsh, sorry, it's a Chicago Parks District site, but it's the oldest site where we have continuous data after restoration. And basically, immediately after restoration in 2016, you see just an absolute explosion in the diversity of species present, as well as the abundance of those species. And there's no reason why powderhorn would be any different for this. So we're excited to carry on this restoration work in the next few years and see what happens using marsh birds as our metric for success within this project. And of course, we also monitor places within Wolf Lake. So while we won't see significant restoration of the vegetation within Wolf Lake in this project, it will be interesting to compare and contrast between the two. With that, I just want to thank the flurry of funders and partners that have helped us develop this project. You know, whether that's folks working on restoration in tandem or providing monitoring or research guidance to us. So with that, we welcome any questions and we appreciate the invitation and the time.
Brad, let's postpone the questions and answers maybe until the end of the 3 panels, because I'd like to, we're running overtime. So I would like to introduce Lauren Lumba from the US EPA.
Hi, Michael, and thanks for having me today. I'm also going to share my screen since I don't have a camera to join you all, so just bear with me here a second. All right, and hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. As you mentioned, I work for the US EPA, and I'm the project manager for the Shroud Property Superfund site, which is just west of Wolf Lake. So this is kind of a nice segue into that. I'm just going to give a really brief presentation today on kind of an overview of the Superfund program for those of you that may not be familiar with it at the federal level, a little bit on the site history, and then kind of jump into some of the next steps for the project. So as I mentioned, my name's Lauren. I'm the project manager for this site. I work out of the EPA Region 5 office in Chicago. And our job is really to manage cleanups throughout the Midwest, from Minnesota all the way down to Ohio. So before I kind of jump in about the Shroud site in particular, I wanted to just make sure everyone's aware of what Superfund is. I'm sure you've heard the term before, but it's a nickname for the law that requires EPA to take care of hazardous waste sites and gives us the legal power to force the people who created the sites to clean them up or repay the government for our cleanup efforts. So the nickname actually comes from a trust fund that provides money for investigating and cleaning up these sites. So in the late 1970s, a lot of these toxic waste dumps, such as Love Canal and Valley of the Drums, received national attention when the public learned about the risk to human health and the environment posed by them. So in response, Congress established CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act in 1980, which, as I mentioned, is called Superfund informally. This allows EPA to clean up contaminated sites, and it also forces the parties responsible to perform cleanups or reimburse the government for the cost of EPA-led cleanup work. And when there is no viable responsible party, Superfund also gives EPA the funds and authority to go ahead and clean up contaminated lands ourselves, kind of as a last resort. So the way we kind of rank sites for cleanup and prioritization for funding is a list called the National Priorities List. A lot of times you'll hear people say this is the list of the worst contaminated sites in the country. It's a nationwide list that's published of sites that are eligible for federal funding to pay for extensive long-term cleanup actions. So this list is kind of ranked using a system called the Hazard Ranking System. It evaluates a number of different factors, including soil, groundwater, and surface water contamination, to come up with a score to determine if it would be eligible for federal funding or not. EPA uses information collected during a lot of initial assessments that are often performed by state agencies, since Illinois EPA kind of provided a lot of the data for the shroud site to score it and assess the danger posed to receptors. So if a site has a high enough score to make it on the NPL, it's proposed in the Federal Register, which is the official publication of the U.S. government, and the public has the opportunity to comment on whether the site should be included on the NPL or not. EPA then responds to the comments, if applicable, and then announces the decision to either list it or not in the Federal Register. So this is kind of how we came to be involved with the Shroud Property Superfund site, which you see here. It was proposed in the NPL last June of 2019, actually, and finalized last November 2019. So you can see the boundaries here. I think you're all pretty familiar with where this vacant land is, but it's just west of Wolf Lake. It's bounded on the north by Indian Creek, and then on the other sides by wetlands and rail lines. So like Steve, I really like these historical maps. It kind of shows a good history of what has happened at the site, and you can see the blue pin on this one. I've tried to keep it consistent through all my slides, showing where the Shroud property site is, because sometimes, you know, the landscape looks much different as you go through the years. So this is an 1892 map. You can see the property that's currently known as the Shroud property is really part of Hyde Lake, and it's still kind of located within those wetlands, but it's just kind of amazing to see the amount of change that's happened in this area in the last century or so. Jumping ahead to 1900, you can see how much has changed in just a few short years. So as industrial development began, with a lot of the railroad tracks that you see on the boundaries of the site, you can see that it's quickly been filled in over the course of, it was filled in with slag from area steel mills and other fill material, and you can see by 1900 it was pretty much, the Hyde Lake was pretty much completely filled. I also really love the historical photos that I've been able to find, and you can kind of see here, this is just south of 126th Street looking north, but I'm not sure when this was taken, but you can see a trolley car kind of passing through on the rail line, and this is right at the Shroud site, and you can see just how different the area looks than the wetlands on each side of the rail line. So as I mentioned, Indian Creek is the northern boundary of the Shroud site, and it was built prior to 1929 as a channel that was created to drain the Hyde Lake wetlands so they could be built upon. It's 1.25 miles long from Wolf Lake, and I've seen it going in other directions as well. And as you can see in this photo here, there's a lot of leaching of heavy metals that continues to result in that cloudy color of the creek. It's likely due to the high concentrations of calcium carbonate in the slag that's on the southern boundary near the Shroud site. And like this picture, you can see it really well. And again, this is just another historical map, 1929. You can see the blue pin again for the site, and this ditcher channel that's up here, which is kind of in the area of where Indian Creek is now. So as I mentioned, the slag disposal is somewhat of a kind of a messaging process historically, and it's a byproduct of that process. As you can see here, over 500 tons of slag can be produced by a single blast furnace daily. So trying to manage this material has been, I think, a challenge in the past. So it's primarily composed of silica, lime, and a variety of metal oxides, which we've seen on the site. And although slag does not contain organic compounds, there's been a lot of other materials co-disposed with it in the past. So that's something we're keeping an eye out for, as well as we're beginning to investigate the Shroud site. So heavy industrial use of the property began in the 1930s when Republic Steel eventually purchased the site and a large portion of the surrounding area in 1941. Steel production activities were performed north of the site up at the Republic Steel plant. And beginning in the 1940s, I think around the mid-1940s, the steel processing waste or slag materials from Republic began to be deposited on the northern portion of the site. So I found kind of a nice Chicago Tribune article in 1952, and they reported that the city of Chicago produced more steel than the entire country of Great Britain. So I think this expansion of land that Republic owned was just a necessary way to kind of deal with a lot of this waste that they were producing at that time. Here's another historical photograph of the old Republic Steel plant. And so in addition to the slag material that they were depositing on the site, the steel production for Republic also produced flue dust, which at least partially composes the piles that are approximately 30 feet high at the site, and as well as electric arc furnace dust, which was generated by Republic and stored with the flue dust until about 1983. So this is that reddish brown dust that can be seen on site in numerous portions of it, especially on the northern side. This dust is what's really considered a toxic waste due to its content of heavy metals such as zinc, lead, cadmium, manganese, and iron. And so this is something we're especially concerned about. When steel is produced using an electric arc furnace, I've read that it can produce up to 45 pounds of the dust per ton of steel. And just as a reference, by the late 1970s, Republic had at least 3 of those in operation. So they estimated they produced about 11 million cubic feet of this dust, which was starting at the north and moving down to what's the Shroud property now. So I like these historic aerials as well. You can kind of see what's happening at the site over time. On the left, it's 1964, and you can see kind of some material being filled in on the west side of the site. And by 1967, you can see the entire site is pretty much in the process of being covered with slag material. You can also see a lot of the leaching in Indian Creek on both, predominantly from the north side, but I think as time goes on, you see it coming from the south side as well. And so from 1967 onward, it seemed like the dumping of slag materials kind of occurred from north to south across the site until the entire site was pretty much filled. Moving along on the left again, you're in 1975. The property is pretty much completely covered with the slag material except for the far southeast corner. And by 1982, there's some larger piles and mounds of slag material present on the site, as well as a lot of equipment and general refuse in the middle and southern portions as well. And by 1988, the equipment or refuse has kind of been removed, but there's even more slag material on the north side of the property and some additional piles of materials on the western and southern portions. So getting into more recent history, finally, in 1984, Republic merged with J&L Steel to form LTV, and then they declared bankruptcy in 1986, and again several times through the years before closing all their plants in the early 2000s. In 1994, the site and several other properties were purchased from LTV Steel by developer Donald Shroud, but the property has not been developed and still sits vacant as a result of, I think, the vacancy. There's been a lot of historic illegal dumping and trespassing on the site, which continues to this day. So as a result of these environmental concerns, the state referred the site to the EPA Federal Superfund Program for investigation and potential cleanup. And, these are some recent pictures that I've taken over the summer and that I've received from others over the summer, showing kind of what it looks like today. So moving along to kind of the environmental investigations that have been conducted at the site so far. Prior to listing the site on the NPL, there were 2 early investigations conducted by the state to kind of evaluate the extent and severity of the environmental impacts. This was part of the HRS scoring that I mentioned earlier. So the first inspection, which was done from 2016 to 2017, focused primarily on soil contamination. And the second expanded inspection from 2017 to 2018 focused on soil contamination as well as the sediment in Indian Creek. And you can see, I just found this aerial photo yesterday. You can see pretty clearly on the north side, especially some of those reddish areas with some of the electric arc furnace dust, and then the larger piles throughout the northern and central part of the site. So the purpose of the first site inspection was basically to determine if there were any hazardous substances on the site and what type of risk they posed to nearby residences as well. The one positive of this inspection was that residential soil samples came back relatively clean from 4 different properties in the area immediately surrounding the site. None had any lead or chromium exceedances, but 2 had high levels of calcium and magnesium. On-site soil and sediment samples, however, found elevated levels of several metals, including lead, chromium, hexavalent chromium, and zinc, among others. So these are kind of the 4 most concern for us, especially the presence of the hexavalent chromium, because low concentrations can have toxic effects on the aquatic plants and animals, and that's really our highest priority, is trying to keep some of this material out of the creek to prevent any further impacts. So at about 62 parts per billion, we know that algae growth is prohibited or inhibited, and at 16 it inhibits growth in salmon. So just for reference, the highest hexavalent chromium that we found on site is about 85 parts per billion, which is higher than those thresholds. If you do want to check out a copy of this report, by the way, it's available on the EPA website, which I'll link at the end of the presentation. And it's in the site documents folder. Pretty much everything I have is there. So if you'd like to look at it in more detail, you're welcome to access it there as well, or email me and I can send it to you as well. So in 2017 to 2018, the state also did an expanded site inspection to kind of further study the impact of the site on Indian Creek. And as you can see on the top left, several dead fish were observed in Indian Creek during the site inspection. The pH levels in the creek in some areas were as high as 11.5 or 12. And there were also about 15 metals detected at high concentration, more than 3 times background in sediment. A lot of the same metals that we're seeing on site, including arsenic, cadmium, chromium, lead, manganese, and zinc. And so the obvious kind of conclusion of the ESI was that Indian Creek has been impacted by hazardous substances from the site, and we would be able to pursue cleanup of that as part of the Superfund program as well. So really quickly, I know we're running short on time, but kind of the next steps on the federal side. So after a site is added to the NPL, we conduct community interviews and develop a community involvement plan. Our community involvement plan, we did the interviews over the summer virtually, and the plan was finalized in August and published on the website. We're also required to establish and maintain an information repository so that the public can access all the documents related to the site. Right now that's available online, but we're going to be probably printing that and making it available in local library as well as our record center once that reopens. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the enforcement piece, prior to spending federal funds, we need to make sure we identify the generators and transporters of the waste on the site, as well as the owners and operators of the site, both current and historic. So that's really been the primary focus of EPA's work in 2020, was to send as many information requests as possible to those that may be liable, and we're kind of in the process now of evaluating these responses and making an enforcement decision on how to go forward with cleaning up the site. So that decision is expected in 2021, and we're currently in line for EPA funding in 2022, hopefully, if it's needed. So once the enforcement process is concluded, then we will begin the remedial investigation and feasibility study, which is the mechanism we use to further investigate the problems at the site and determine the best way to address them. The RI would involve gathering and analyzing a number of samples, soil, surface water, groundwater, and waste from throughout the site and along the borders to determine the extent of the contamination, if there's any off-site impacts. It also would involve assessing the risks posed by the site. And then once that's complete, we begin the feasibility study, which is the analysis of potential treatment method. During the FS, we look at the advantages and disadvantages of each cleanup method to further explore that. But really our short-term goals for 2021 are to, as I mentioned, wrap up the enforcement process, begin an RIFS, and also prior to that, secure the site. We're working with the emergency response side of the Superfund program in Region 5 to hopefully begin doing some targeted access restrictions to prevent vehicles from accessing the site and others from trespassing on the site, and hopefully that will get kicked off in the spring. Finally, we've kind of been looking at a little bit closer at the existing data for this site, just to work with what we have and try to look at if there's any groupings of samples that are similar on site versus off site. And this is kind of probably hard to see, but there's 3 different colors on here, and it kind of shows the distinct qualities of each of these samples that were taken, both soil and sediment, on site and off site. And you can see they really group very clearly. Blue being distinct from green, the blue offsite being distinct from the green on-site samples, even up along Indian Creek, which is encouraging because it looks like the off-site impacts are really pretty limited at this point. Obviously, we need to do a lot of further investigation on the site. This is only a handful of samples, but it's so far looking like we're focusing on the right areas of the site, and that the off-site impacts are pretty limited at this point. So I've got my contact information up here, as well as the community involvement coordinator. His name's Herberto Leon. Both of us are available to answer any questions that you have. We also try to keep the website updated as much as possible, which is linked here. And then finally, Herberto asked that I put a plug in a little bit for the mailing list as well. So if you do want to get updates about the site, you can click on the Stay Updated and Get Involved link on the left side, and sign up here for the site's email mailing list. And so that way when there's any updates made to the website or if we publish anything on there. All right, and with that, I'll stick around after the final panel if there's any questions. Also feel free to reach out to appreciate the time today to kind of just do a brief update on the site, and hopefully this will be the first of many in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We can have some Q&A over the first 2 panels today. If there's any questions, Mary, could you check the chat? I did through chat. There was from Matt Miller. He just wants to know that it was the voice of the community that finally convinced the city and state to recommend it to Superfund, the Southeast Environmental Task Force, Jamie Boberick, and many others. And also from that, it was great to see progress on Shroud. Thank you for the work, Lauren. Looking forward to 2022 at Indian Creek. Okay, are there other questions? If not, let's move on to the next panel, which are reports from 2020 and projections for 2021. And we can start maybe with Tom Bakula.
Yeah, let me share my screen because it's got some pretty pictures. There it goes. So 2020 was obviously an interesting year for everyone. We started off a fish survey at Wolf Lake, the Indiana portion, right before everything really started changing in early March. The first day we set nets was March 10th, and we pulled those nets out of the water March 16th. Went to the next lake the following week, and we set nets for an hour before we got called off from fish work for the next about 3 months. But at Wolf Lake, we were really going after northern pike. As Steve was mentioning, there's a lot of great pike in Wolf Lake. It's really nice to see. I don't have too many lakes with a lot of northern pike. So this survey that we were doing was just to it's a northern Indiana assessment of all our northern pike lakes. We're getting to all the ones that have historically had pike, currently have pike, just to see where we're at. It's been a long time since we've really done any pike work. With that, we set some sizable nets for us. They have a 300-foot lead that comes offshore to intercept fish as they swim along shore. At Wolf Lake, some areas can be kind of difficult because it's really shallow, then it drops off really quick. However, those areas were pretty good because a lot of them connect back to marshy habitat where those pike are going back to spawn. As I mentioned, we were really gearing towards northern pike, but did measure our northern pike, walleyes, and muskie because that's some of the important fish that we would be getting that time of year, just to see where we're at. And we took fin rays to age those fish. So to get right into the results, for northern pike, we collected 46 fish. Nothing too terribly big, but did get a lot of nice quality sized fish. I mean, it was pretty fun. But mostly there were males, a few females were in there, so we might not have hit the run quite right or right locations. But overall, it was still a pretty good survey. And looking at our records for other northern Indiana lakes, it actually was one of the higher catch rate lakes. And so, as I mentioned, we primarily going after pike, but we also measured our walleyes, which was probably the biggest surprise of the survey, that we caught 57 walleyes. And some really nice individuals. The walleyes are stocked from Perch America. They've been doing it for 20 years now, almost. I think they've missed 1 year out of the 21 years that they've been doing it due to fish production issues. But really good, saw some really good survival of those fish. I mean, you can look at the length frequency on the screen, and they're doing really well. There's a couple little weird hole type of things, but not sure what that is, but really it's not a big issue because there's a lot of fish and there's a lot of nice fish for anglers out there. We even did catch which we don't typically catch, we caught a small 9-inch fish, which would have been from the 2019 stocking, when they stocked those from 6 to 8 inches and grew a couple inches come spring. I also mentioned we measured the muskie. A single muskie was collected. Kind of interesting that we have both Esochid big predators out there. Not a terribly large fish by any means, but pretty interesting to see a muskie in addition to the pike and walleyes. Other fish that we caught were some crappies, bluegill, a few bass, just your general lake species. In the spring, those nets are really selective towards pike and walleyes. So thankfully we don't have a ton of bycatch, carp or anything like that to deal with. And so with what we did this year, we were planning to go back there again in April to do a more in-depth walleye survey, just because those walleyes tend to move up a little later in the year than pike. However, with catching 57, it was great. I mean, that was a great survey. Real pleased with those results, and obviously going back later had to cancel that. But don't really have plans to go back next year because we did so well collecting those walleyes this year, and really can get that evaluation about the lake as well as to Perch America, who has been doing that stocking. With this year, I mean, everything was messed up, so I was really thankful to have a lot of great volunteers, especially the Cook County Forest Preserve guys, Steve, and some of his helpers. IDEM came out one day to collect some fish for contaminant sampling. Perch America, Bruce Caruso was there every day we were doing stuff. Really pumped about seeing those fish. So thanks for his support coming and the continued stocking. And another volunteer from LaPorte County, Jason, came out when we were picking those nets. there's questions about it, I can answer those now or later. But if you have any other things that you want to see, feel free to drop me an email. I can send you the information, and we'll get you the report when it's done, hopefully in the near future. It's just taking a little bit of time to age those fish with fin rays, a little bit extra that goes into it. So that's all I have for you.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Let's forego the questions until at the end of the entire panel. Next one up is Frank Jakubczyk. Is that how you pronounce it, Frank?
You're on mute, Frank.
Frank,
Oh, it's going to be off. Can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay. We say Jakubczyk, maybe
Yeah.
that's the American version, versus
That's
Jakubczyk.
exactly how I pronounced it, Frank.
Yeah, yeah. The last time I was at Wolf Lake was 2017. I was scheduled to come back this year, but the Natural History Survey was doing an intensive survey, so I bypassed that. Plus, we got shut down until early June. Most of my surveys are done in May. Last time we were out there, we collected 23 species of fish with our DC electrofishing gear and set some pike nets. Only caught some common carp and a couple northern pike. So in May, it's probably too late to go after, like Tom said, some of those northern pike. But we did see a good species diversity with our electrofishing gear, and that's our main sampling technique nowadays. In the past, I've seen for Iowa darters, that was something that was kind of had been noticed for maybe 15 or 20 years. So we went after Iowa darters a couple years ago, found a bunch of those, and of course banded killifish, and Phil's got a lot of information on banded killifish in Wolf Lake, but those are easy to come by. To add to stocking, in Illinois, we stock a whole lot of fish in Wolf Lake. We stocked roughly 30,000 2-inch fingerling walleye this year. The lake normally gets 15,000 2-inch walleye. Northern pike wise, we've been stocking traditionally 2,000 fish a year, but in 2017, 2018, and 2019, no northern pike were produced for our hatchery system. So the lake didn't receive stockings then, but it did receive another 2,000 fish this year. So we put most of those, well, the hatchery truck puts most of those in what I call the main pool, the boat ramp so the boat ramp, the lake, that's got the isolated northwestern corner, that gets a few fish, and most fish go at the boat ramp on the other side. So they're available to be moving throughout the whole system because of the connections. This year, in the past we've stocked northern smallmouth bass, but we stopped that stocking and started amping up our largemouth bass stocking. So we put in roughly 15,000 largemouth bass this year, 4-inchers. That number is amplified only because for years and years and years, we had no northern pike going in. So we're going to try to shift the population or the predator base a little bit more towards bass fishing instead of, like I say, northern pike. But we'll probably make adjustments now that we can produce northern pike again. We'll drop the largemouth bass stockings. What I found interesting recently was that, like Steve had mentioned, the connection originally was just going to be water, and now it's going to be potential for small fish movement. And so the information that everybody provided today is very helpful for me, because I've got a call to Hay and Associates right after this to talk about, with their ideas on some of the movements that might take place. But it is going to probably be small fish. I don't think this is going to be more than 6 or 8 inches of water in the pipe. So it's not going to be a big fish moving. We're not going to have salmon coming from Lake Michigan going up into Powder, and it's going to be small stuff, probably. But that'll all be determined for whatever best management practices are decided on. So, and I'm here for questions. So,
Okay, let's hear the rest of the panel. Durs, are you with us?
Yep. Also.
Yes, and I'd like Durs to just talk about the bike path that is planned to somehow get across Brainerd Avenue at Avenue O and Burnham Avenue.
Right. As you all know, the Burnham Greenway, which was built substantially almost 20 years ago, has had this gap between William Powers and State Road on the south end of the village of Burnham. It's been a difficult gap in the village of Burnham because we have 5 railroad tracks at the north end, 5 railroad tracks at the south end. The village will be building a bridge at the south end. There's no road crossing. The village had followed the IDNR phase 1 engineering at the north end across that grade on Burnham Avenue, but the railroads opposed that. And so for 6 years, we've been basically stuck in the Illinois Commerce Commission, which likes to see everybody agree. And we weren't, the village of Burnham, you know, being a very small village, wasn't willing to build another bridge at the north end. And so we were at loggerheads. Jill Sabo, who was the executive director of CMAP, approached Cook County Highway Department and asked basically if they would get involved in the project and sponsor a new grade separated bridge at the north end that would cross all the tracks and probably Brainerd Avenue itself, approximately at the South Shore Station, on the east side of the South Shore Station. Cook County took that project on and said we would do it, and we would not even use federal money to fund it in order to move it more quickly. That commitment happened about 1.5 years ago, and that's basically begun to give us a solution to get the Village of Burnham's trail built as well. So I have to give tremendous credit to Cook County and Cook County Highway Department for taking on that commitment. They're in the middle of phase 1 engineering for that new bridge at the north end, which will again be near the South Shore Station. That phase 1 engineering will be finished in the spring of next year. They'll then start phase 2, the final engineering, sometime later next year. So we envision Cook County, if everything goes smoothly, and the fact they're not using federal monies, that potentially they could get their bridge under construction in about 3 years. That's the best hope. So let's say it's 4 years. The Illinois Commerce Commission itself has even committed $2 million to that bridge in safe crossing funds. Illinois Commerce Commission committed $2 million to the Village of Burnham's bridge at the very south end of State Road. So now, if the village finally gets out of the Illinois Commerce Commission, let's say in the next 6 months or so, it still has about 1.5 years to maybe 2 years to finalize its final engineering, get permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. IDOT required us to do a new wetland delineation along the entire corridor in the Village of Burnham. We just finished that a couple of weeks ago. That was a surprise, and we had to find funding to do that new delineation. So the village project is pretty much coming on a timeline, very much in coordination with the Cook County Bridge. And that's what the railroads have been fearful of the whole time, is that the village project would open up before the Cook County Bridge would open up. So we think we've reached a point, just time going by, you know, where these two projects are going to come online together, and we expect that construction will occur sometime in the 3 to 4 year time period. With regard to Wolf Lake and William Powers and the Indiana side of Wolf Lake, again, a lot of credit to Hammond and the Hammond Hammond Port Authority for the trail system that they've developed. On the Illinois side, you know, much of the Burnham Greenway is developed that really brings us almost into a linkage through Calumet Park, Chicago Park District, Calumet Park, you know, to a really dense system of bike trails, 20 plus miles of existing bike trails surrounding Wolf Lake and then heading out in different directions, not counting this 2 mile gap north of Brainerd Avenue and south of Brainerd Avenue. There's no bike network that's that dense anywhere else in the Midwest in an urban area, in a rural area. So it's a great amenity for people all over the region. And I think, as this final 2-mile connection is made north and south of Brainerd Avenue, we're really going to see an influx of bicyclists from all over the region, Indiana and Illinois. And the last point I'd make is that the Cal-Sag Trail, which goes all the way from Lamont, all the way across the south suburbs, probably 2/3 complete already. Its final stretch through Dalton and the village of Burnham, that contract for construction is going to be let next spring. So the Cal-Sag Trail all the way over to the south end of the village of Burnham, where its trail bridge will be built 3 years from now, that Cal-Sag Trail will be in place by the end of next year. So these final connections are all being made, and I just see Wolf Lake in the future as a great attraction and amenity for bicyclists, as well as hikers that want to do long distance. But I think it's really going to add to the economy of the south side of Chicago and in Hammond. And we're finally just 3 or 4 years away after a long period of time trying to get it done. And if I have time to toss in 30 more seconds, I talked to George Belovics yesterday from the IDNR. Some of you may remember that, we've also, a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we're hoping to develop a trail down the State Line Dike right through the middle of Wolf Lake that would connect all the way down to 134th Street at some point. And that's going to really be driven by improvements to the road on the State Line Dike, to improve access for fishermen, better pullover parking and all that. So that's a real project too. But the problem is it's there, it's laying and waiting. But George said basically, with the election yesterday and the turn down of the alternative tax for the state of Illinois, there's going to be drastic budget cuts across all state programs, and the governor's already warned that. It's in the paper today. It's not going to be pretty. And so I'm not saying that's a project that's never going to happen, but the IDNR is going to be stressed out with budget cuts along with every other state agency. And which projects happen, which get delayed, we'll just have to let time go by. But hopefully, someday in the future, that project down the State Line Dike can happen as well. So thank you.
How about the along 134th Street?
Yeah, that's Open Lands received a coastal management grant to do the final engineering of a trail along 134th Street right to the Indiana state line. That was done for CDOT. CDOT has that final engineering. And so Hammond, when we were in serious discussions with Hammond and the Hammond Port Authority 4 or 5 years ago about making that final connection around the south end of Wolf Lake, for good reason, Hammond and the Hammond Port Authority are not going to even talk about doing a trail through their property until the trail on the State Line Dike is built and until the trail along 134th Street is built to the Indiana border. So both those projects, are not being pursued right now. And so therefore Hammond's, I think has just lost interest at this point. They want to see something committed and put in place on the Illinois side first. Okay. The engineering's done, which is a major step forward.
Yeah, thanks. Adrian, is Adrian here today? Okay, I didn't remember him checking in. So we have about 10 minutes to ask questions and hopefully receive answers from any of the 3 panels this morning. If there are no questions, let me check chat.
Can I ask you a question, Michael?
Yeah.
You know, one thing I noticed, the connection of Powderhorn and Wolf Lake is tremendously exciting, you know, and I know you've been focused on that for a long time. So it's terrific to finally see it moving forward. I was wondering why the corridor along 134th Street was put in a pipe, you know, rather than an open water body. You know, so I was looking at that engineering diagram. Could somebody is there an answer for that one? It just seemed like a long stretch of pipe. I was wondering why that was necessary.
Are you referring to the stretch as it follows along 134th Street?
Right.
East to west?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we raised the same point. I think that was the engineers choosing the easiest option, and when they kicked that back to us, the project partners, we told them that we would like to open that up. So that is currently where it is. We just don't have any updated documentation showing that more open swale alternative.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Other questions? Wow,
Phil.
you know,
How about a question for Phil? Did you find the eastern or western banded killifish in Powderhorn? What are you thinking?
Yeah, so we don't know quite yet. I was out there and with the natural history survey that Steve sort of referenced about a month ago, and we grabbed a bunch of samples. So they're in University, Illinois, and they're going to work them up this winter. So we don't know for sure what they are. Some of them are probably Western. I'm curious as to whether they're a mix. So, but I think what I'm going to do is I'll step back so that more people know what's going on here. We have kind of a bigger project on banded killifish. It's all through Illinois, and it's bigger than that. And Powderhorn has long had a great population of these banded killifish. So we went out there, grabbed some about a month ago, as I just said, with the natural history survey. They're going to look at the genetics of these. We also grabbed samples from just about every pool in Wolf Lake, and those will be all worked up this winter as well. And in Wolf Lake, we found western banded killifish and hybrids with eastern banded killifish. So we got a mix in Wolf Lake, and not all of those have been worked up yet. So we're kind of curious as to, are we seeing differences among the different pools? Are they moving around the pools? But we'll get a pretty fine genetic study of these things to see how these small fish are moving around, hopefully by spring. So keep pestering me, keep asking. And you know, we got some more information coming in. And as I'm talking here, I got one other thing that I'll toss out there. We put pit tags in around, I think, close to 200 mud puppies in Wolf Lake. So if you end up putting these passive transmitters in the pipe anywhere along there, I'm curious as to whether you'll get any hits from mud puppies. Most of those are more in the northwest corner, central pool near the flagpole, sort of that area. But they could certainly walk down to the southern, walk and swim. They kind of do both, down to the southern point there. And I'll be curious if they move through those pipes and marshes as well as they could. They could, I don't know, but you know, we have those tags in them, so keep your eyes open.
Those things just add to the uniqueness of the whole Wolf Lake area. I mean, you know, they're.
Yes, I can see that electronic connection. I was thinking of that when Steve and Brad were talking about it. And I was wondering, Steve, do you make annual reports on fish at Powderhorn?
We previously weren't doing them annually. We do them every 4 to 5 years. So we have gotten on Powderhorn. We got on it in 2019 to try to do something a little expensive before any sort of project began. So we do have you know, general information available on the website, on the Forest Reserve's website, as well as more specific data here in the office.
Oh, okay.
So yes, just not annually,
Okay.
but we're definitely going to be following it more with this project going on.
Yeah, and that project is fascinating. I agree with yours. It's we've been working on it since late 1990s, and that's kind of when I came around. So there may have been something before then. And there was some opposition to the reconnecting. I can recall back then, because they didn't want any of the invasives from Wolf Lake getting into Powderhorn. But seems to me a long time ago. So.
And typically in these larger scale reconnection projects, the positive benefits kind of far outweigh the small chance of some invasives, which they're never really eradicating anyway. So they ultimately end up finding their way in some way or another.
Yeah, you can't get rid of them.
Aside from the forest preserves, fish reports of the Powderhorn system, though, we will be getting some nice in-depth reports from the Natural History Survey guys as well. So that'll definitely help to supplement any data we have on the fish populations.
Good. Anything else? Okay, tomorrow we start off at the same time, and we're going to be talking about dragonflies and pollinators. And then we're going to have a discussion of enhancements for the Wolf Lake watershed, much of which we discussed today. If there's anything new, we'll be opening that up for a discussion. Thanks to everybody for joining this morning, and we'll see hopefully most of you tomorrow as well.
Sounds good. Thanks for organizing this. It's been very informative. Thank you.
This was really good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Mike, for putting this together.
All right. I enjoy this. I learned so much. Believe me, I learned so much. Yeah. So you're all doing me a favor. Take care.